Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Best Practices for Annotated CRFs. My name is Amy Garrett, and I know you guys could be doing anything else right now, and I'm so honored that you took time out of your busy days to come and listen to me talk for 40 minutes about annotated CRFs, and I'm going to do my very best to make sure that it's worth it. So like I said, my name is Amy Garrett, and I'm the lead product manager at Pinnacle 21. I joined the company a little over 2 years ago and work on all of our products, but spend most of my time working on enterprise. It's my job and my pleasure to be a user advocate and ensure that we continue to innovate and create solutions that make your jobs more productive. Prior to joining Pinnacle 21, I was actually a user of our software, and I worked at a couple different CROs as a SaaS programmer where I was creating CDIS deliverables. I have personally and painfully created several annotated CRFs, so this topic is particularly important to me. So with that, let's get started. If at any time you have a question, click the little chat icon in the GoToWebinar application, and I'm going to save some time at the end of the webinar to go through those questions and provide as many answers as I can. Okay, so let's briefly go over the agenda for today's webinar. We're going to start with a brief introduction about what the annotated CRF is. We're going to cover some definitions, and we'll also discuss why it's so important. After that, we're going to discuss the regulatory requirements that are out there today, followed by the industry guidance that's out there. I'm going to talk about the creation methods that are available for making the aCRF. Then we'll talk about how to validate and verify the content of the aCRF. And finally, we'll wrap it all up and do the Q&A portion of the webinar. So what is the aCRF and why is it so important? All right, well, the annotated CRF, as it's defined in the technical conformance guide at least, is a PDF document that maps the clinical data collection fields used to capture subject data, either electronic or paper, to the corresponding variables or discrete variable values contained within Sdtm datasets. So that's quite a mouthful. I think it's a little too long. I decided to shorten it and to just say the aCRF maps clinical data collection fields to variables or discrete variable values within the Sdtm datasets. And so with this definition, you can also think of the aCRF as a low-tech data dictionary, right? It visually represents how data are mapped to the Sdtm in a very easy to understand way. You don't have to know Sdtm to be able to interpret the annotated CRF. And if you're looking at any of your annotated CRFs and you're thinking to yourselves, wow, like only an expert would be able to understand this, only an Sdtm expert could understand this, you're probably not annotating them correctly, and because that certainly should not be the case. So this is just an example of what an annotated CRF could look like. This is just one form. But this shows that you don't really need to know Sdtm to be able to interpret this, this document, right? It's pretty clear from this form that the randomization date is going to go to something called DS-STDTC. And I can kind of tell from the color coding that, that the DS term and the DSD code for that record is going to be randomized. So if I'm looking for the randomization date, I'm going to look for a record where the DSD code's randomized, and then I'll know that DS-STDTC is my randomization date. So this is a very clear and easy to understand form. Now, it's really important that it's clear and easy to understand, right? Because it's used by regulatory agencies during the review process. At the FDA, it's the aCRF is a very important reference document, and it may be viewed independently or together with your define.xml, using the hyperlinks in the define.xml that link out to the aCRF. And remember, again, reviewers often have a limited knowledge of Sdtm. So when they need to find where a specific piece of information is at in the data, let's say, for example, they're looking for baseline gene expression status, like that's something that, and that could be on this aCRF. So it's often easier for them to find that information just by looking at the annotated CRF than it is for them to find it in the define. And so this is why a high quality annotated CRF is just so important. But it's also important for your study teams. Your study team can use it as a reference document throughout the entire course of the study. Some of the more common examples of how the study team uses it is a lot of times it's used as a resource when creating atom specifications, because it's much easier to review the annotated CRF than it is to review the Sdtm Excel specifications. I think probably many people on this call can all understand how quickly and easily Excel specifications get out of hand with highlighting and strike throughs and comments and all kinds of crazy stuff. So if you're trying to create your atom data and you're just trying to figure out where a certain piece of data is in Sdtm, a lot of times it's just easier to find that by looking at the annotated CRF. Sometimes it's also used by data management, right? So sometimes, especially when data management is reviewing Pinnacle 21 validation reports, if you have an issue, let's say you have an issue in your PE domain, and so if the data manager is not familiar with CDISC and they don't necessarily know the variables that are being spit out, but if they can figure out what those variables are in the EDC system, then they'll be able to take action. And so the annotated CRF sort of bridges this gap between the Sdtm and the EDC system. So that's sort of another common use case within study teams of the annotated CRF. Okay, so now let's get into regulatory requirements. One of the key best practices, of course, for creating any annotated CRF is to make sure you follow the regulatory guidelines. There are 2 documents published by the FDA that have requirements that are applicable to the annotated CRF. It's the Technical Conformance Guide and the PDF specifications document. And I'm going to go through both of those. So let's go over the requirements from the Technical Conformance Guide first. They are in section 4.1.4.6. If you want to go and look them up yourself. And they're obviously not, I have them listed out sort of in more bullet style, but in the document, of course, it's a paragraph. So, but let's get started. So the first one is that the annotated CRF should be submitted early, preferably at the time that the protocol is submitted. I'm not aware of anyone that's actually done this because so often the annotated CRF just is not available that early. But this is the requirement that's documented in the Technical Conformance Guide. So I felt the need to share that the FDA does want the aCRF essentially as soon as you have it, it seems like. The second piece of guidance here is that it should include treatment assignment forms when applicable, and it should match each variable on the CRF to the corresponding variables in the data sets. And this requirement really just kind of gets back at the definition of what the aCRF is. The aCRF is supposed to map variables from the CRF to their corresponding Sdtm values. So this one I think is a little bit of redundant of the definition. The third one is that it should include variable names and coding for each CRF item. And this one's a little tricky because I've read some interpretations of it that you should include the codings for every single CRF item. So if you were to have, for example, a radio control option where there was 5 different radio buttons, you would actually write out the codes that each one of those radio options was mapped to. And you would do this all the time. Now, but there's other times where maybe, especially in cases where the values printed on the CRF are very similar or identical to the values that are in the Sdtm, I think in that case it's certainly not necessary to write the coding for each of those terms. I think really writing the coding makes most sense when the coding differs from what's printed on the CRF. The fourth item is that items that are not submitted should be annotated with the text "not submitted." and there should be a reason and explained in the reviewer's guide for why those data were not submitted to the Sdtm. And the fifth and final piece from this document is that the aCRF should be a PDF, and it should be provided with the name aCRF.pdf. So as you guys can see, there's really not very much guidance from the technical conformance guide. So there's a lot up for interpretation. But let's continue on. So since the aCRF is a PDF, it becomes subject to FDA's portable document or PDF specifications. So we're going to go to the requirements from that document. So the first one is about versions. Acceptable versions of PDF are versions 1.4 through 1.7, as well as PDF A1 and PDF A2. The font size should be between sizes 9 and 12. This particular requirement, I think, is as it relates to the CRF, like the blank CRF. Annotations, as we'll discuss later, there are certain times where annotations might need to be smaller than size 9, so that they don't obscure any other text on the form. But ideally, most fonts should be able to fit within this 9 to 12 guideline. The text should be searchable, so that includes the text on the CRF forms as well as the text in the annotations. Both of those should be able to be searchable. You should include a table of contents with hyperlinks to bookmark pages. The font color should be black for most text, and hyperlinks can be blue. This requirement is particular to the CRF forms, as you'll see later on, and as we even saw in the previous screenshot of that sample CRF form. A lot of times the text of annotations is not black or blue. Often it's red. So this particular requirement, I think, the way that we interpret it is that it applies to the CRF forms, but not to the annotations themselves. Number 6 is that the aCRF should be readable via Adobe Acrobat. There should be no password protections on the document at all. Zoom settings should persist when navigating through the document. And I'm going to show you guys how to check that in a later slide. You should use a standard font. The standard fonts are Times New Roman, Arial, and Courier. If you're not able to use a standard font, then the font that's being used needs to be fully embedded into the PDF. If you, by chance, or if you have a PDF A, then the font does become fully embedded. So one way to fully embed your font is to save it as a PDF A. Number 10, a hyperlink should be active. So anything that looks clickable should be clickable, takes you to the correct place, all that good stuff. And number 11 is that the left margin, or it's the top margin if you're doing a landscape, should be at least 3/4 of an inch. On all other margins should be at least 3/8 of an inch. And this requirement does pertain to annotations as well. So all the annotations need to fit within these margins. So I want to show you guys how you can check the version of your PDF using the free version of Adobe Reader, the latest one that's available. So you're going to go to the File menu and then select Properties. Once you do that, you'll be taken to a screen that looks like this, and you're on the Description tab, and in the bottom section there, under the Advanced section, if we zoom in, we can see that this particular PDF is of version 1.4, which is an acceptable version. There are some other there's other PDF editors that will show you if you have PDF A, yes or no. I was not able to find out that Adobe Reader, at least the free version, it doesn't seem like it tells you if it's PDF A or not. So you're going to have to use a different software to determine if you have PDF A. And then I also just wanted to quickly show you how to persist zoom. right? So if you recall, one of the requirements was that zoom settings should persist when navigating the document. So to check that your settings persist, at least with Adobe Reader, you're going to go to the View menu and then select Preferences. Then to check what your zoom setting is, you on the left menu select Page Display, and then you can set what the zoom level should be. And then to ensure that it persists, on the left pane you want to select Accessibility, and then ensure in the Override Page Display section, ensure that always use zoom settings. Make sure that that box is checked and that the zoom setting is set to the same thing it was set to on the previous screen. All right, next we're going to cover some industry guidance. This includes suggestions from CDISC as well as suggestions from the existing literature. Suggestions from CDISC come from two documents. The first and the oldest document is the Metadata Submissions Guidelines, affectionately called MSG, these guidelines were finalized in December of 2011 and published by the CDISC SDS metadata team. The second document that contains some requirements is the Sdtm aCRF Guidelines. It was published in September of 2019 by the German-speaking CDISC users group. It's currently in draft, but it consolidates the technical requirements, recommendations, formats, and technical prerequisites from various organizations. And the guide has many of the same recommendations as the MSG, plus some additional recommendations. And so I've sort of consolidated all of that guidance into eight key points. So the first one is that the aCRF should be bookmarked in two ways. It should be bookmarked by visit and by form. Okay. And so that way, no matter how you're trying to navigate the document, you have an option. The next one is that the aCRF must be complete. It contains all final unique CRF pages and modules, and it should not contain any blank pages. So if there's something that's not submitted, if the only thing on a CRF is not submitted, it should say not submitted and you shouldn't have anything that's blank. The third criteria, if more than one domain exists on a page, each domain, annotation, and its variable should be color-coded. So in the example where, let's say you have a form that has information that goes to the demographics domain as well as the subject characteristics domain, you may choose to make the demographics domain have a background color of blue and have all the annotations that are belonging to the demographics domain have a blue background, and have all the subject characteristic annotations have a yellow background. So that would be an example of the color coding. The fourth criteria is that the aCRF should not have database annotations on it. So you shouldn't have any EDC variable annotations on it. It should only have the Sdtm variable annotations on it. Oh, 6. Oh, that should say 5, I think. So I think I skipped a number here. But the next piece of information is that each domain that's represented on a page should have its own annotation in the upper left side of the CRF page with 2-letter domain code and domain name. And so, for example, taking that same example, if you have information in the subject characteristics domain, you would have an annotation at the top of that page that says SC equals subject characteristics to denote that there is information on that page that goes to the subject characteristics domain. Next is all text in the annotations. All text in the annotations that represent variable and domain names should be capitalized. And if possible, annotations should not obstruct any text on the CRF page, right? And so this is, of course, this is if possible. There are situations where it may not be possible. A sponsor may choose to resize the domain annotations based off of the CRF layout, and you may have to size down your annotations below that the 9-point size recommendation, so that text is not obscured. But obviously, you can't make it too small or it won't be readable at all. So the smallest that I would probably go is 8. But that's sort of my personal preference. The last one here is that if there's any additional data sources that are used, such as like patient diaries, that they need to be appended to the aCRF instead of submitted separately, or instead of being submitted as part of the reviewer's guide. And in this case, your origin is still EDT, even though you're appending it to the CRF. Your origin would still be EDT and this requirement's only needed if the additional data source is not transcribed into the eCRF. So if the information is actually copied into the eCRF, this requirement is null and void. When I was doing research on this topic, I went all out. I must have read every single paper out there on annotated CRFs. I found a couple suggestions that I wanted to share with you guys today. The first is that you should use conventions for annotations. Using conventions for annotations really, really helps down the line. It makes every other process easier, whether that is QCing or whether that might be actually trying to set up some sort of automation process. Everything becomes easier if you choose to use annotation conventions. And I have some more information about annotation conventions on the next slide. The second thing is that when applicable, you should annotate the category variable. When it's printed on the annotated CRF, it's sufficient to just annotate whatever the cat is next to what's written on the CRF. But if the category is not printed on the CRF, you need to actually annotate cat equals and then list the value in quotations. And the reason to annotate the category, right, is that it makes it easier to understand whenever people are trying to find anything in the data. So it sort of goes back to the example I showed previously, specifying what those other identifying, not identifier variables, but what those other variables are that can help the reviewer find the record that they're looking for is really helpful. So, and that's where category is helpful for that. It's helpful to be able to narrow down the data that you're looking at and find specifically what you want. The third thing is to use a separate annotation for each variable and to only combine variables that map to the same value. So for example, for example, a lot of times what I've seen vital signs forms where the value is collected, but the unit is actually not collected. The unit is just printed on the annotated CRF because it's a standard unit. And so this is really common in something like blood pressure, right? Where we're collecting, where it's always millimeters of mercury. So in that case, on that vital signs form, you shouldn't, in the same annotation, you should not include VS-ORES and VS-ORES-U, because you're not actually collecting VS-ORES-U. You've printed it on the CRF, but the value that you're collecting for the blood pressure, the actual value of that blood pressure, that field doesn't contain any units in it, right? So it's appropriate to combine it with, it might be your standard character result. So it might be appropriate to combine ORES with stress C in that case, but it's not appropriate to combine ORES with ORES-U in that case because the unit is actually not part of the collected field. And then the fourth and final one here is that when variables prefix don't match, include the domain's prefix in the annotation. So for example, associated person's demographics domain for the SREL variable which denotes how the subjects are related. Since SREL there's no, if you don't know Sdtm, you have no idea that SREL is something that's reserved for associated persons domains. So it's important. So in that particular instance, you might want to append APDM in front of the SREL variable annotation to make it more clear where that variable is at. And then sort of to go on with the annotation conventions, this is a sample of table of conventions adapted from a paper that was published in 2015. On the left, we have the different annotation types. We have domain, variable, variable and value, supplemental QVal, value level, and then unsubmitted data. And then on the other two columns, we have the annotation pattern, and then we have some actual examples of how that might play out. So it's good to have a table like this for your company so that people that are creating the annotated CRF know the conventions that need to be followed. All right, so let's get into some creation methods now, especially now that we've covered the content and the technical requirements of the CRF. In January of this year, Pinnacle 21 conducted a survey about annotated CRFs. Some of you on this call might have participated, and if you did, thank you so much. But we asked participants, we asked, what methods do you currently use to create the Sdtm aCRF and to check all that apply? And we received responses from 350 people and from the industry, and we found that 85% of respondents said that they create the annotated CRF using a manual process. So that means 85% of people, right, who are creating the aCRF are placing each annotation on the PDF using the viewer or editor. Only 25% reported using a SAS macro, and just over 10% reported using some other process. So by and large, most people are creating the annotated CRF manually right now. For people, when we ask people to explain the other process, what that other process was, most examples of that was something kind of called the FDF method. Later on in the presentation, I'm gonna hook you up with a resource if you want to read more about the FDF method and see if it might be something that could work for your organization. So unfortunately, so the creation method section was very quick because ultimately the answer is you manually create it. But since it is a very manual task and a human is doing it, that must mean it's very prone to error. So it's important that we understand how to validate and verify the contents of the aCRF. So to do verification of the annotated CRF, what you can do is you can perform programmatic comparisons between the aCRF and the define XML and/or mapping specifications if you have them. In the case where you have a completed annotated CRF and define, you can do the comparison in two directions, right? You can check that where the define has an origin of CRF, you can check that there's a corresponding annotation on the correct page or pages on the aCRF. And then on the flip side, right, you can take the aCRF and compare it to the define to make sure that the variables exist and are on the right pages. So while reviewing and reconciling the differences between these two documents is good, all it really does is ensure that they match each other. It doesn't fully validate the documents. So in order to do that, we need to visually inspect the aCRF against a validation checklist. Any kind of validation checklist you use should be customized for your organization and have any internal requirements represented. To get you guys started, I've created a sample validation checklist that I'm going to go over here. So the first thing is that the document needs to meet FDA technical requirements, of course. It needs to meet MSG requirements. Each domain that's represented on the page should be listed at the top of the page. All annotations follow predefined convention syntax. When annotations are on the page, when all annotations on the page belong to the same domain, the background color of that should be light blue. When annotations on the page come from multiple domains, the annotation should be color-coded by domain. Eval is only annotated on CRF when collected. Annotations don't obstruct any text on the page. It's clear for each annotation which domain it belongs to. All data points are annotated, and not submitted is used when data are not mapped to Sdtm. When applicable, the category variable is annotated. All annotations do not contain typos and are searchable. And annotation text does not contain any pseudocode. And so this is just an example to get you started. This is not all the things that might go into a validation checklist at your organization, but it's something to help get you guys started. And so briefly also so a picture kind of always says 1,000 words. So I just wanted to go over just a couple examples before we wrap up about sort of some examples of what not to do. So in this example of what not to do, what we see here, this is a pretty good form, but it wouldn't meet our validation checklist criteria because the domain annotations are not at the top of the page. What we can see here is that the subject characteristic domain annotation is actually kind of in the middle of the page. So while this might meet a verification step, it wouldn't necessarily fulfill that validation checklist step. Here's another example. In this example, we have a data visit form, and this data visit is used for a lot of different dates throughout the Sdtm data sets. And so the way that it's been annotated, though, really you really have to understand Sdtm to be able to understand that annotation, to know that --DTC means that it goes to a lot of different date variables. Another thing is that the specific ones, DM, SC, and IE, domain annotations are not listed at the top of the page here. And I'm not even confident that all the dates are fully represented here. And there appears to be a typo in subject visit start date as well. So there's a lot of things kind of going wrong with this particular form. And then the last example I wanted to show is an example where we have 3 different domains that are going to the same form and the importance of the color coding. In this example, the annotations have not been color coded and they all have a light blue background, and it's very difficult to quickly be able to see which annotation belongs to which domain. So this is where this would not meet that validation criteria that domains are color coded. All right, let's wrap this thing up, guys, and do some Q&A. So just in conclusion, right, follow the regulatory guidelines. It's in 2 different documents, the Technical Conformance Guide and the PDF specifications. Try to follow the industry guidelines. If you're not following it, ask yourself why. It's hard is not a good enough answer. It's hard for everyone. Everyone is creating this document manually. Don't let the difficulty stop you from establishing a good process and demanding high quality. And lastly, establish a process that works for your organization. Take what I presented here today and build upon it in a way that works for you and your organization, and then codify that in a standard operating procedure or a working practice, whatever seems appropriate for you. Like I said, if you want more information about the FDF method, I'm going to refer you to my paper, which talks about the FDF method and then provides even additional links to additional papers where you can read even more about the FDF method. You can also read the full paper. There's a lot of good citations in there. I did a lot of research on this topic, so check it out. You can access it on our website by going to community and then selecting useful links, and it's listed under the good data validation practices section. All right, so let's do some questions. I think we have like 3 or 4 minutes, so I'll try to answer as many as I can during that time. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay, here's a good one. Can Pinnacle 21 create the annotated CRF for me? The answer is not yet. Hopefully we're working on it, but we're not able to do it yet, but it is something that we hope to be able to provide in the future. So that's a great question. Let's see. What else? How should I annotate the Railroac is a question. Okay, so actually you don't need to annotate Railroac. There should not be anything in Railroac that's only in Railroac, right? Like, so because the Railroac is relating your records together, and so even if, let's say, you have, your AE records related on their SPID, on AE SPID. AE SPID's collected, so you don't need to annotate the Railroac information at all. That it's going above and beyond it. It's just not necessary. So don't do it. Let me find another question here. Okay, here's one. So this question is, do I need to annotate the variable? Do I need to annotate the variable on each page or just the first occurrence? So if I understand this question correctly, I think what they're saying is if a variable exists multiple times on a page, do you need to annotate it multiple times or just once? And you would need to annotate it each time it exists on that page. So for an example I can think of is status, right? So if you have a page that has maybe 3 or 4 questions, and each one has the ability to have that status of not done, and so even though all of them are mapped to status, it's 4 different fields on the CRF, and so since it's 4 distinct places on the annotated CRF, it would need 4 distinct annotations. So that's a great question. Let's see what else here. This is a good one. Are there any variables that I should not annotate? That's a good question. There probably are a lot more than I can think of right now. You should definitely not annotate sequence number, right? Like, so definitely not sequence. Probably you shouldn't annotate the pre-specified presp. You can annotate occur, but you should not annotate presp. Presp is indicating that the question was pre-specified. So the fact that it's on the annotated CRF is enough. You don't need to also annotate presp equals Y. Baseline flag is probably another one also that you wouldn't annotate unless it was explicitly collected. If you are deriving the baseline flag, you would not annotate it. So those are 3 that I can come up off the top of my head, but I'm sure that they're, well, in addition to the Railroac that I mentioned earlier, so don't annotate any of the Railroac. There's probably several more, but those are the ones I kind of can think of off the top of my head. Let's see. Okay, another question about Pinnacle. So does Pinnacle 21 check my annotated CRF against my define or vice versa? So the answer to that one is it does not currently. We are currently working on creating some compliance checks against the annotated CRF and define. So we're working on that, but it's not currently in production. But in terms of what the system can do today, or at least what Enterprise can do today, is it can go ahead and populate page numbers for you. So if you have a define.xml and you don't have all of origin populated and you don't have pages populated, but you can have that define.xml in our system, and then you can actually import your annotated CRF, and we will populate. If we find the annotation, we'll populate the origin as CRF, and we'll populate the page numbers that we find it on. So it's not a we don't currently offer the ability to do that, to do that verification comparison, but we're currently working on it. But what we do have is the ability to populate pages from an aCRF import into the define.xml. Let me see. Oh, okay, I think I have time for one more question. Let me see. What if we only have this question is, what if we only have unique pages and not the full CRF? Is that sufficient for submission? Yes, that's totally okay. You don't have to have the full book. In fact, you don't need it. You only need to have the unique pages. And if you do have the full book, you only need to annotate unique pages. So if you have pages that are duplicated, you can annotate that page in such a way that says see annotations on page whatever, where whatever is the first occurrence of that page type. So yes, so you only need to include unique forms, and if you have all forms, you only need to annotate the first occurrence. And I think that's all the time I have for questions. Keep in touch, please. Send me emails, send me anything funny, send me jokes. There's my email, agarrett@pinnacle21.com. And you guys will receive an email when the slides are posted to our blog. And thank you guys so much for joining this webinar today. And I hope to hear from you all.